Good morning. Just realized I was not on the agenda.
Good morning.
Um, oh geez. Um, um, cool. So we have a few things to get through today. I'm gonna have it looks like Martin's the first one on there, but we can just go around and introduce ourselves first. I'm Alex. I'm with DoorDash.
I'm Martin with Apollo.
Hey everyone, I'm Calvin, also with Apollo.
Hey folks, I'm Benji from Graphile.
Um, Let me straight. I didn't get a whole lot of sleep last night, so I might be a little touch out of it. Just a heads up. But I think first on the agenda is the state of experimental features with Martin.
Yeah, it's just I just added this so that we get an opportunity to make a small status about what's available everywhere so that people can try
Mm-hmm.
nullability, semantic nullability. And thank you, Benji, for adding to my initial list. There are a couple of things. We have support for semantic non-null in servers and clients and catch, which are actually, and I realize that a bit late, but are tracked by Jordan Awesome Semantic Nullability repo. So I just sent a PR there to update it. And then we have stuff that is more like tools, so PostgreSQL sock, sorry, because there is a single sock. I always forget about this. And GraphQL 2, as well as, and this is not captured in Jordan's document, I think, but the directive to throw an error and or disable error propagation. So what I'm going to do is probably consolidate everything in Jordan's repo if he agrees to include throw an error and disable error propagation there, so that we have a single place where we can track all the different implementations that are already out there. And if you think of something that is not currently in this list, either in the agenda and or in the repo or some semantic nullability, please let me know.
This is awesome. Yeah, I really like that you did this research. It actually spawned me to go off and do a little bit extra myself. I've put some extra stuff on my blog. I've got a new nullability post, which we'll talk about later. But at the bottom there, I've also noted a few other servers that have got either pull requests open for semantic non-null or issues to track them. So yeah, it's pretty exciting.
Cool. And the big news, and I should have started with this, is that GraphQL code generator now has support for semantic non-null. Yay. That's a big milestone. Yeah. And async GraphQL as well. Cool. Very, very cool.
I saw the
What,
code
what do you,
stuff got merged too. That's awesome.
yep. How do you want to proceed, Benji? Should I open a pull request on Jordan's repo with everything consolidated? Or are you taking care of this in your blog post, maybe?
I think putting it in Jordan's repo, since it already exists, makes sense. My blog post is opinionated, whereas the other one should probably not be.
Yeah, it's reference material and it's also going to evolve more than the blog post. So yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that's all I had for this specific item.
Cool. Yeah, excellent work, everybody. That's very cool that we've got this sort of getting released. Next up, we've got Benji's new proposal. I think it's probably because again, the sleep thing, but I was having kind of a hard time following what was being proposed. Is this a like solution number, what are we on, 8, 9?
It's not really, no. It's solution one again in
Okay,
different clothes.
got it.
What I it's a different positioning of what the best practices would be with solution one. So it's a change in the interpretation of it. But it doesn't, I don't think, change the implementation significantly. Though I did actually go through today and update the GraphQL JSPR. I haven't actually updated the spec. So if I just give you all, if you look at the link in the agenda, there is a 60-second video. So if you take a moment to watch that video, it is very fast. And then I will go into more details. If you want to maybe give a thumbs up on Zoom once you've seen it, that would be great.
I'll wait for everybody to do that. I've got a couple of questions.
Hopefully that was long enough. Yeah, so essentially the main difference here is that rather than presenting the aim being that we want semantic non-null types, is actually much like Martin's proposal. We want to get to an end state, and here's how I see the future of GraphQL. I see it looking exactly like it does today. I see clients sending the same queries that they do today. I see them basically everything is the same shape as it is today. No extra syntax, no extra whatever. The only difference is we'd have more non-nulls, right? And we would also have no null bubbling. And I think we've generally agreed that the future of GraphQL is with null bubbling disabled and with error handling on the client side. So we've already got things that handle that, such as relays, catch, and error on throw on field error. We've got GraphQL tow, which you can use to add support to basically any GraphQL client as well. What we need effectively is a way to support these legacy clients so we can get to that state. So if you don't have legacy clients, you just go to that state today. We're already there. We've already got GraphQL tow. We've already got the experimental disable null bubbling directive, error propagation, sorry. So that's it, we're there. All this proposal is to do is to enable our existing large users that have deployed applications to allow their new clients to use this new behavior without breaking their old clients. So rather than calling it a semantic non-null, which is technically what it is still, we call it a transitional non-null to make it clear that you shouldn't really need it going forwards. It's just there during the transition. So in future schemas, you probably wouldn't see an asterisk anymore. It's just for those legacy applications.
Okay. So when you're talking about legacy applications, uh are you talking about apps that already exist in the wild and they're hitting a server, and we're talking about ones that aren't going to be um
Updated.
updated? Okay.
Yeah, so old mobile apps is a good way to think about it. Ones that are on such an old version of iOS that they literally cannot be updated anymore because, Apple doesn't accept updates for them or whatever. That kind of thing.
Sure.
Old Android apps.
Um okay. So um right. Okay. New clients, what are they doing? Are they sending the no null bubbling flag, and then um
So I see these, right. I see the future as having null bubbling turned off. But the mechanism that we choose to do that, I think, is still under discussion. And we've got this disable error propagation experimental directive. I personally think it should be a request flag. And the reason request
we
property,
can get into that in a second, but just ignoring the mechanism, they're turning off null bubbling.
all clients would be in future turning off null bubbling, yes,
Okay. And in that case,
but not
uh
the legacy ones.
there's effectively no difference between what we're currently calling strict non-null and what we're currently calling semantic non-null.
Yes, if error bubbling is disabled, there is no difference between those two things.
Got it. Okay, so with air bubbling disabled, then strict non-null can be treated as semantic non-null. Um, and I guess, are we saying so then, but these legacy clients, they're not going to be hitting new fields. I'm gonna let Calvin go, I think.
Uh, so we said the future state is that nobody is doing null bubbling, right? What is the future that it goes away, or this directive is then in everything?
Let's pivot to talking about that for a moment. I see it as a separate but related issue because these two things come hand in hand. We've got disabling error propagation and we've got semantic nullability. And effectively, semantic nullability is an answer to what do you do when you've disabled error bubbling. So how do we disable error bubbling? At the moment, or the original proposal was to do it with a directive. I forget what I called it originally, but like one of the other ones I proposed was disable error propagation. But since then, I've thought about what we want to do in the future, which is it should just work. Right. In 20 years' time, if you're starting a GraphQL schema from scratch, you shouldn't need to include disable error propagation on every single document, right? And more
That's what I'm getting
importantly,
to.
yeah, more importantly, we don't want to make it so that you have to have tooling add that for you. It's actually a property of the client. It's not a property of the document. So either the client handles errors or it doesn't. And if it's an error handling client, then in the interim period, like now, it should tell the server, hey, I'm an error handling client. Don't do null bubbling. And it doesn't need to do that through the document. It can do it through the request, right? By putting a flag on the request, a header, a property in the request body, whatever. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In the GraphQL specification, we don't talk about HTTP or any other transport method, right? But we still have what we call a request. And a request is composed of the schema, the document, the operation name, and the variable values, right? Note that the schema is part of the request. You would never, as a HTTP client, send the schema along, but a request includes the schema. So I'm saying a request should also include whether or not errors should bubble. And that way, it's actually a server concern. And if the server wants to expose that to clients so clients can choose it, that's its choice. If the server wants to make it so that error propagation is just turned off by default, that's also its choice, and it can do that. So our schema that we create in 20 years' time would just do that. It would just turn off error bubbling from the very start, and we're done. And the clients don't need to even include anything extra. But in the interim, when you send query, operation name, and variables, you would also send error behavior null or error propagation false or some other property like that.
Does that mean, Benji, that in 25 years from now, we will drop support for non-error handling clients so that we can remove that parameter completely, that request parameter? I wish I can live long enough.
You notice that I've put much longer than a 5-year window on this one. That's due to the HTTP spec. I don't think we necessarily ever need to remove it from the GraphQL spec. The number of lines in the GraphQL spec that it would take up, I think, are minimal. I really don't think it's a big concern.
Question is, do we allow conformant implementation to not honor the client parameter?
Yes.
Okay.
Because the GraphQL spec, again, doesn't care about that. The request provides the schema. The request would provide also this. Whether or not the client provides it is a different question.
Yeah, this is what I mean. Like, so wait. The request has a disable error propagation parameter. That's going to be in the spec. It's going to take a few lines. But are we saying that at some point we allow some servers to not honor this parameter, like, and always disable it, no matter what the client sends?
Probably we wouldn't say don't honor it. Probably what we would say is if you receive it and it's set to false, you're allowed to reject the request.
All right. Sounds good. Which, if we write it now in the spec, some people could actually start doing it now.
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't have to wait 25 years.
Yeah.
They can just only support error handling clients. Okay.
Yes, and we don't need any of this for a new schema from today, basically.
Yep. Fair enough.
Alex.
Would you mind like walking us through what schema, like does this require schema or not schema spec changes to make this work? Is this like a new GraphQL feature or?
Yes. Okay, so there's two parts again. There's the disabling error propagation, and there is the semantic nullability or the transitional non-null.
Oh yeah,
So
I'm just talking about this sort of what are you calling it? A request? Are you calling
request
it a
parameter?
request? Yeah.
Yes. So to document that in the spec, I think is like I think I've already got a pull request open for it from ages ago, but it's like 3 lines. It's not very much. GraphQL spec. And
If the server doesn't support this parameter, it will simply ignore it.
What we were saying is if it
yes.
doesn't support it, yeah, it can ignore it. Yes.
Yes. So essentially, what I originally proposed with this is that you would request. So technically, we define all of the parameters in a request, right? But we reserve that namespace. That's why we have extensions as one of the keys there. So you can add other stuff in there, but we can add other stuff here. So in general, if a server doesn't understand one of these new parameters, it should just ignore it and everything should work as it did before. So the idea is that you would add a property to the request saying, please turn off null bubbling. And then the server would either support that feature, in which case it would turn off null bubbling and give you a response and say, I've turned off null bubbling, here's the response. Or it would just give you its old traditional response. in which case it wouldn't include the extra I've turned off null bubbling property on the response.
Okay. Do you have that PR with the spec changes? Yeah, I don't know. I'm having trouble figuring out like separating sort of the HTTP-ness of it all and the like what's
Yeah.
the spec?
So this is spec changes for the directive, which is not the right one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I actually have spec changes for the request parameter yet. I've got a discussion open on the nullability working group. I also have an implementation of it, which I did today actually in the GraphQL.js repo, so maybe that would help.
Oh, sure. Yeah, because
I'm not sure if it has everything in it.
the directive is nice because it uses zero brand new GraphQL features, right? It's just a directive. And that's
But
kind of a nice property of it.
there are still changes to the execution, obviously. Like
Yeah,
you need something
it would
to.
use the same part as that. And GraphQL already has a request object and a response object. So we would just be adding extra keys to those. Those are already things that exist in
Got it.
the request form.
We're talking about Stephen, we're talking about uh we're talking about the two proposals to turn off null bubbling right now. And then we're going to circle back around to transitional non-null.
Okay, so my GraphQL JS pull request is here. The part you care about probably is the execution, source execution execute, which is the second file in the pull request. And essentially, what I'm currently proposing is that we would pass, along with the parameters you would normally pass, which would be things like document, context value, variable values, schema, operation name, and all the other ones that are less used, you would also pass an error behavior. And I've currently proposed that that would be either propagate, which would be the default, which is what we do currently, null, which would mean turn off error bubbling, essentially put a null where the error goes, or abort, which would mean bubble the error all the way to the root of the document and just throw away everything.
Mm-hmm.
Martin.
Yeah, so one nice thing with the directive is that for iterating, it was very convenient because it doesn't require any work from like servers. Like you just put it in GraphQL.js or in GraphQL Java, and you don't need to update DGS or like Apollo server or whatnot. Like it's taken care automatically by the framework, by the implementation. If we're going the request parameter route, which I think we should, we are going to need to work a bit more with all the different implementers out there.
That's correct.
I'm gonna look through this later. Thank you for putting this together. You said you put this together this morning?
So this is my old pull request for solution one, and I've just been updating it with my latest stuff. It's not fully done. I was still working on it when I went for dinner. So it passes the tests, but it doesn't have tests for the new stuff yet. So it may not work for the new stuff. We'll see.
Okay.
It's something I'm going to be putting a little bit more time into.
I have no strong feelings really one way or the other. Can you run through again what you feel the advantages are over of this over the directive approach?
All right. So imagine in future that you have two endpoints. You have /GraphQL and you have like /GraphQL no bubbling, or /GraphQL2 if you wish, right? When you send requests to /GraphQL2, there's no bubbling because it's provided as part of the request. So you don't need to include a directive in every single one of the documents that you send to the server. You don't necessarily need to include a
Sorry,
parameter.
when you say it's provided as part of the request, you mean in
The
GraphQL
GraphQL
2
request.
has erased null bubbling. We know we're no longer concerned with it.
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Continue.
So yeah, when that server forms the GraphQL request rather than the HTTP request, it would provide the schema and it would say error bubbling false, or error propagation, error behavior null, or something like that. And by doing that, I'm thinking about like what we want in the future, and I don't think that we want in the future every single document to have an extra like directive marked up on it, because that either requires one of two things, right? It either requires that every document is essentially produced by the client, like we take the document that a user has written and then we manipulate it on the client before sending it to the server, which
is what
doesn't
Martin's
mesh well.
doing.
Is that what you're doing, Martin?
Oh, excuse me, I wasn't following.
You insert the no null bubbling directive into requests as they go out.
Yes, we have a compiler. It's not as they go out, but we compile the request beforehand, so we modify it.
Yep.
And this is a common pattern already in the GraphQL ecosystem. So I don't want to say that it's a blocker, right? It's not a blocker. We already, like Apollo client, for example, just adds like underscore type name everywhere, because it's useful to have that kind of stuff. But I don't think that we as the GraphQL spec should require that, right? It should be fine for someone to write a request manually and for that to be sent by the client to the server without manipulation. So go on.
The typical use case is some people in your team want to experiment with the API. So they use graphical or whatever ID is given by your backend team. They type a query in there and then they put it in the Android or iOS app. And they want it to behave exactly the same. And if we do transformation in the compiler, it's not going to be the same because what they type in graphical isn't going to be transformed. So that's my strong argument for like not doing this actually. Even if it's convenient. I mean, it was convenient to experiment and iterate, but I agree we should move it to a request parameter.
And because y'all also do that with like type metadata underscore things, right? Or like you also manipulate the request as it goes out or as you compile it.
Yeah, we do a type name underscore type name. Yeah, we do that as well.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah, it's already something we do, and it can be a bit surprising, but it hasn't been a huge issue because like, users do not really care. But if we start changing the execution algorithm, that might be a bigger issue. It's not additional data that you get, it's really the shape of your response that is changing between graphical and what your app sends. So I don't feel really good about it.
I think one of the things that's probably more important to note is this is no problem for Apollo client, for Apollo Kotlin, for Relay, right? For all these big GraphQL clients that already have like engines involved in them and compilers and all this other kind of stuff. What it does matter for is things like fetch and graphle and other things that literally take the document that you've written and send them over the wire. Those don't want to be even doing parsing, let alone like AST manipulation to add things and then reprinting it to send it over the wire on the fly. Like that's not ideal at all. And you want to be able to write documents, even if you're just using window.fetch, you still want to be able to write documents that you can use with like persistent queries and stuff. And with something like GraphQL Toe, you can make something that uses window.fetch into an error handling client that handles errors on a field basis. So you can get all this great power just using window.fetch, and we shouldn't require you to have to also add this directive to every one of the documents that you write by hand in order to actually leverage that fully.
Status quo though, Apollo Kotlin, the rest of the clients would have to add, if we did the request parameter, would have to add that request parameter to requests. Like instead of a directive, they'd be adding a request parameter, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And so would your fetch client, right? but your fetch
Yeah.
client would be doing it by just adding an extra property to the JSON rather than parsing, manipulating the AST, and then printing it and then sending it over the wire.
But that feels a little bit better maybe than manipulating the document that gets executed.
Just adding a JSON property, yeah, for sure. And again, like in the future, if you have an endpoint that just disables by default, then you just have to change the URL that you send to and you're done.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think yeah. Okay. Cool. Great. Okay. So circling, did we cover everything you wanted to cover there, Benji? Do we want to circle back to traditional non-null?
I think we've covered it unless you have any real questions. I think the main thing is thanks to Martin's solution 5, I'm really leaning into that the future of GraphQL looks exactly like the current state of GraphQL. Like you should just have bangs and nothing else. You should just have regular requests, no extra directives, not in the document, not in the executable documents, not in the SDL, not in the schema, no extra types. It should just look like it currently does. And the one thing that stops me from basically saying we should just go with solution 5 is we do need to support legacy clients. Like we can't just break them. And so the transitive non-null is just a framing that I think makes it clearer that if you have to support legacy clients, you can use this transitional thing, but everyone else doesn't need to use it because it's not, we wouldn't call it anymore maybe semantic non-null, we would call it transitional non-null, and then you would know that you didn't need it because it's transitional.
Aside from the framing, you said there were some changes you had to make. Are there functional differences between, or like mechanical differences between this traditional non-null situation and solution 1?
No, it's all advisory, it's all advice.
Okay, got it. Okay. I think that clears it up for me a little bit. Okay. Got it. So okay. So the advice here would be that if you are starting today, do not use star. Encourage your clients to disable null bubbling and treat your strict non-null fields as semantic non-null fields.
Yeah, basically the future that I see is that we don't call anything strict or semantic non-null. We just call it non-null like we always have done.
Yeah.
So we just encourage you to put non-null where the data, where the underlying, that's a confusing way to say it, sorry, the underlying data, your actual data in your stores, for example, is meant to be non-nullable. So you would just put a non-null there. And it's
But
as simple as that.
if you have legacy clients, then you should be using the star syntax.
I would say, yes, if you are an existing schema with legacy clients, you should be
Yep.
using the star syntax. If you are starting a new schema from scratch today and you want to support legacy clients that don't understand semantic non-null, then by all means just put bang everywhere too, right? You're going to end up with clients that have the errors propagating further and make them more risky. And the solution for that for them is, well, become an error handling client and turn off error propagation. It's not change the schema and use semantic non-null. So the semantic non-null, the transitional non-null should only be used by, for example, Facebook, who already have these existing apps and need to support them. It shouldn't be used by any schema that is created from today onwards, or from whenever this lands onwards.
Here's a question. So if we're talking about legacy clients, like we could call those like embedded clients, right? These are clients that exist out in the world. We cannot update them. they aren't going to be using any new fields that get published, right? Um, and we're not talking about changing any existing fields from nullable to non-nullable. Who is the star for then? Like if we're saying that any clients you can update, you should have them disable non-nullable, then those clients should be able to handle strict non-nulls as semantic non-nulls, right?
Yes. So any new field that you add from the moment that this is accepted should just use the true, let's call it the true nullability, right? In Jordan's sense of how he frames the word, the
Bang
semantic
syntax.
nullability. It should use bang to indicate that something is not meant to be a null.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's true for all new fields. For all existing fields that are already nullable, if they are semantically non-nullable, if they should have been non-nullable, they're the
Mm-hmm.
ones that you would add the asterisk to. And yeah, that's actually a really good catch as well. That's not one that I'd factored into what I've written, so that's really great.
Okay. Okay. So no new fields. Additionally, no new fields should be using the asterisks. It's changing existing fields that should be semantically non-null to be treated as such. Okay. Okay. Cool. Martin?
Yes, and just another piece to add to this puzzle, by the way. I propose that this that we are discussing as solution one, if we were to choose, I forget which one it is, solution 6, where we use the semantic non-null directive, I propose that everything else stays the same. The only thing is that the semantic non-null directive would replace the asterisk effectively, but the behavior would be what I described today.
This was my question actually. Like, I think this is more or less what Facebook is already doing with the directive. Cool.
I mean, as I say,
And
it's the same solution that I wrote up like a year and a half ago. It's just phrasing it differently and like
yeah,
practicing it differently.
and I guess for Mela, the important thing is that they will get first-party support in introspection and this kind of stuff, which they don't have right now. Cool.
Yeah.
Stephen, Steven, did you have any input? Maybe he might have stepped away. Um, okay. Cool. Um,
I have
I
one remark for the sake of exhaustivity. Did you see Lee added a proposal like 1 hour ago or something like this?
no.
Which is doesn't have a name, but it's a bit similar from what I understand. It's a long proposal. I haven't had the time to read through all of it. But my understanding is it's a bit similar to your proposal, Benji, except it uses a directive.
I think Lee's
Uh,
one looks at it
no,
from the other side. It
yeah, it's
effectively
symmetrical.
it lowers it's closer. You remember my double bang solution
Yep.
3? It's solution 3, but where the double bang is represented with a directive instead. Except it's a little bit more subtle than that. Rather than opting in with a directive, Lee is basically saying, I think, that we don't care about introspection. Like existing deployed clients shouldn't be doing introspection, is I think what Lee is saying. And thus, if we change introspection, we won't break them. So we can now say things are non-null in the introspection, so long as what we mean by non-null is semantic non-null, and that will not break existing clients. And then we then further indicate the fields that specifically should bubble as an additional thing. So rather than marking up the semantic non-null fields, we're marking up the fields that should bubble, or what we've been calling the strict non-null fields. So it's similar in that regard. I think there's a few issues with it. One is like Lee says, we don't want we don't want 3 types that represent this. And like, I agree, right? In the future, we don't want 3 types. We just want the 2 types. It's either non-nullable or it's nullable. That's exactly what I'm proposing as well. But Lee is saying that by effectively using a well-known directive, we don't have a 3rd type. But I'm not sure that that's really accurate. Like, if you were to represent this, if you were to implement this in GraphQL.js, for example, you would be in the handle errors function, you would need to know whether this has the bubble or not behavior. And you would do that either by looking at the non-null and seeing if it's a variant that has bubble on it, or by having a new GraphQL bubbling non-null, which is it's a new type, essentially. It's just a facade for a new type.
That doesn't work with list positions. I think this is listed as a
yeah. So I think we would probably
limitation.
we would encourage Lee to add the bubble errors brackets levels,
yeah.
Which would make it even clearer that it is essentially a type. It is a type. That said, I mean, it isn't presented as a type, and maybe that's what Lee is leaning into here. I was hoping he was going to make it, but I think he might be essentially saying that if we make this a well-known directive, one that's not necessarily defined in the spec, or maybe it is actually. I think he did lay out spec changes in one of his comments. Yeah, he did. On field errors, yeah. So, I mean, if it's going to be in the spec and it's a directive, how are we going to represent it in introspection? Either we solve issue 300, or we represent it as a type, because I think, honestly, that's what it is.
I think there's a section about introspection, and they suggest adding a new field to the field type, which works only for top level fields and not for positions. Again, same issue.
Yes. Now, I should comment that Facebook, for example, just stripped nulls from the middle of lists. So this might be something that, like, Lee's experience basically says errors don't happen in lists, they happen in fields. But that doesn't match with my experience, at least. Like, if, for example, you've got a list of things and you fail to retrieve like 3 of them, you would put errors in those positions. So
Yeah,
the
it totally
lists
happens.
Yeah. So I think that part's not necessarily viable either. But essentially, if we look at it from the point of the end state, right? The end state is the same. The end state is you have a schema, it uses bang to represent non-null, error bubbling's turned off, everyone's happy. And that is essentially the same as what I have proposed today. It's just the route that we take to get there that I think is it differs. And Lee's route is less backwards compatible. Like, it breaks introspection. Like, it specifically changes what the meaning of non-null is in introspection. So any existing tooling that consumes that would consume it wrong. So you would need to update your tooling before you could update your schema to enable this, which, you know, is a trade-off. There's a few trade-offs like that, I think.
Okay.
But I'll go through it properly. I haven't, again, I went for dinner and then I read this like 5 minutes before the meeting.
Yes, same.
But I'll read it up and I'll write down my concerns in a comment.
Yeah, I gotta read it too. Going into the first of all, I want to say I like the new framing. I think the framing is good. It feels cleaner than what we had before. Going into the primary working group meeting, how are we all feeling? How close do we think we are to a consensus?
Okay, great
It's a great
question.
question.
So let's start with Lee has already backed out of solution 2 in favor of solution 4. And also in this latest proposal, he explicitly has said as well that he thinks that the default unadorned type should be semantically nullable, i.e., we shouldn't have a question mark to make it nullable. Unadorned should be nullable. And the example that he's used there is SQL. Like SQL, an int is an integer or null. And you
By
actually,
semantically nullable, we're just talking about nullable. Okay, yeah, nullable, and we mean it should be null. Yeah, okay, sorry. Continue.
yeah. So the word semantic there was unnecessary. He's saying the default should be nullable,
Got it.
which is different from what he originally proposed in solution 2. He's changed his mind there. And from what you've said before, Alex, you're not exactly the champion of solution 4. So my question is there someone who is still championing solution 4 and still saying that question mark, the semantic, the nullable should shift to question mark, and the unadorned should mean semantically non-nullable? Is anyone still holding that position?
Let me pull up the
I,
original vote.
I kind of like it. I mean, and this was my initial perfect solution. But after working on it for, I don't know, 4 years now, 5 years, many years, I kind of gave up on it because it's just not practical because of all the existing documentation and everything. So if we want to ship something, I'm like, yeah, let's just use existing syntax and banks.
I
Yeah,
think one of
I
my
also
main
have
questions.
I've you know, since I mean, like several years ago wanted that question mark, but now I'm coming around as well.
I like it because it's the most intuitive, just reading, looking at it. Maybe that's because like I work with Swift and it's the same. So maybe I find it intuitive because of that, right?
Yeah, but it's a good point.
But
Like Android and iOS developers, they will find it intuitive, and that's a good chunk of people using GraphQL APIs.
but yeah, it's not a hill to die on. And I fully
Um,
understand that things need to move forward and there is it. I think the difference is like people need to understand why it's this way. Maybe that's only the case if you come from specific languages and need to understand more of the context and history of GraphQL itself to understand why it's still going forward being that way. But yeah, it's as long
Let's
as
be
you get
honest,
to where you want to be
no one
eventually.
gets it. Like, if GraphQL is not your main like day-to-day job, everyone finds it surprising. Like I've had countless discussion in Android conferences about people that I like. Sure, GraphQL is cool, but why the hell is it nullable by default? Like, and no one really gets it. And I didn't get it until 2 or 3 years in GraphQL or something like this. So I did get it really late.
I think it makes sense if you think of the type as being something that you narrow by adding things to. So like adding the bang narrows it to not have the null. I mean, that's essentially what you do with SQL as well, right? You have a type for your column, and if you want to say that that column is not nullable, you add that as an additional constraint over that type. So this is like what we've been doing since like the 80s. When did SQL come out? Like 70s, 60s? I don't remember.
79.
79, right. So that's when we did nullable by default, like in the computer industry, and possibly before then, right? SQL had to inherit from something. So
Yeah,
I don't think it's
I
that
mean,
surprising. It's just it's not used so much in more modern languages.
Java did it in something like this as well, like 30 years ago. So what, 1990? And they are still regretting it. Like it's a pain point for Java user. Like, so I don't know if it's a good way, but it's a practical one for us because it doesn't require changing the syntax.
I think the
Yeah.
key for me to getting on board with it is thinking of schema is not a singular type system. It's more of a distributed type system, especially when you bring in like federation, which is really the power of GraphQL. And if you think in that sense, like so many hops through all these different places, yes, nullable by default makes complete sense.
It doesn't. No, really, it doesn't. Um, Errors by default make sense. Nullable doesn't.
Well,
You don't
Right.
have to use
Yeah.
null to represent an error.
Yeah. By default, it might
okay,
fail.
that's fair.
Totally. But semantically,
You have to
I
separate
think
you
if
have
we
to
were to
join
start,
types and distribution.
I think if we were to start GraphQL again tomorrow, right, and to forget that there was any history of it, then we would do it by not having error propagation, giving the client the responsibility of honoring whether something is non-null or not, and then yeah, maybe using the question mark and unadorned syntax. But given that we do have a history, when we have to think in terms of like, what does this mean for executable documents? Like, should an executable document be written with question marks and unadorned? And if so, how do we tell the difference between a document that does that and a document that does the traditional unadorned and bang? And having the unadorned mean two opposite things in these two different modes, is that going to be confusing? And I think basically that's quite a challenging thing to change. It's the kind of thing that we could change in a GraphQL 2.0. But I think at the moment it's a really, really big shift. And what value does it give to clients? They now need to rewrite all of their operations so that where the
Uh,
unadorned was, they put question
are
marks.
you talking about input types there? Because we don't have question mark or bangs in executable documents, except for inputs.
Yes, for variables in executable documents. So if a
Okay.
variable is non-nullable in
Yes,
an executable
variables.
document,
Yes.
then it would have a bang. And are we saying that should become unadorned and another thing should become question mark? And what real value are we delivering to users by making that change? Either we say, yeah, we are, by making it more familiar, we've added actually a significant amount of value there, then maybe we should shift. And if we were, I think a GraphQL 2.0 would be a great time to do that.
yeah.
If we're not going to change executable documents, then I think introducing question mark to the schema, but not to executable documents, is a really even more confusing thing to do.
Yeah. When we were talking about executable documents, if we were doing a blank slate GraphQL, that's where especially I think the unadorned being non-null makes sense, because that's where it's a breaking change to add the non-null. It's not breaking to make it optional. So by default, you want to make all your inputs mandatory non-null, right?
You're
But
you're right, but also like when you change it, you deploy a new client anyway. So you're not breaking your old client because your old client has the documents embedded.
Yeah, but it's
yeah,
the
it's
same
true. Yeah, when
syntax
it's
in the
in
schema.
yeah, I guess
Right.
I'm
Yeah, I
thinking
see what you
mainly of
mean. Yeah.
defaults in the schema, inputs in the schema. True.
Yeah, yeah.
But
No,
in any
that's good.
case, this is not blank slate. So, there has to be sufficient value to changing the executable document syntax and
So the reason I bring this up
reasons.
is essentially we have 6, maybe 8 proposals at the moment. I think Lee's is probably number 7. And then my latest one, I think, is just a variation of number 1. So I'll just keep it as number 1. So 2 has already been rejected. 3, I've put on hold, but honestly, I'm now even more convinced that 1 is the right solution. So I'm effectively going to say, unless there is a strong barrier to getting 1 through based on syntax, that I think that 1 is probably the better solution. 3 is actually quite close to Lee's proposal, I think. I'm not sure. I need to read through it. 4 is currently lacking a champion, I think. And by the sounds of what we are currently saying, like, it would be nice if GraphQL had always used question mark, which I'm on the fence about, but like, yeah, sure, I don't really care. But it hasn't always used question marks, so the barrier to add it is probably too high to justify the effort. And with what we're currently proposing is that we don't end up with 3 types, we end up with, again, 2 types, just being the existing types. I think we can probably rule it out. So if someone wants us to not rule out solution 4, step forward as the champion of it. And this applies not only to you folks, but to anyone who's watching on YouTube and to anyone on the GitHub issues. If you want the question mark, come and represent it and come and argue for it. Otherwise, I suggest that we reject that as well. What do you feel?
I think so. We can float it to the main working group. Really quick, Calvin, if you were gonna vote again, which way would you go?
I mean, are we adding the new things that we spoke about today?
Uh yes, I guess.
I do like the transitional idea. Like I said, I don't think it's worth a hill dying for, so I probably would not vote on the question mark syntax.
Okay.
Can we do
And then
Yeah,
we've
both?
got more progress in other areas.
if we
Can we
redid that
do?
vote, it would be 7-4 for asterisk. So, you know, four of us who originally voted for the question mark flipped.
Is it exclusive? Like, could we do both? Could we do Asterix now? Like, ship it in 6 months. GraphQL conf, we have solved nullability, and we are happy about it. And in 10 years, we do the opposite shift. Like, we add the question mark again, and we are like Rust and all the languages and Kotlin and Swift, and it's all a happy family in 10 years.
I think if we were to ever do a GraphQL 2.0, and honestly, I do think that GraphQL 2.0 is on the cards at some point in our future, ideally not in the next 5 to 10 years, but I think it's going to happen at some point. When we do that, I think we will probably change the syntax. We would probably just to get rid of null bubbling out of the gate, and there'll be a whole number of other changes, like changes to default values, changes to how of type is represented in introspection, all sorts of stuff like that we would clear up. So yeah, like for sure.
Yeah,
So
I feel
it's
the
not
same way.
lost forever. It's not
No,
like we are giving up on it forever.
no. That means that the remaining people who we don't really know their position is Glenn, BOD, Jeff Ariema, and Jarrell Miller. Uh, and then I guess other people could have flipped in the opposite direction, and that would be Ernie and Jeannie Ha.
Well,
But
before we push too hard on that, let's actually get the spec edits complete. Let's get the implementation complete for solution 1. And then let's basically revisit it at that point. I think there's quite a few things, especially in terms of like I say, documentation advice that need updating for solution 1 to actually represent what I'm currently representing, even though the actual underlying code is basically the same.
okay, I want to try to push for consensus at the next working group meeting. I think I mean we have consensus in this working group meeting. Everybody here is voting for the same thing. So like if we can,
Do we? Because the next question is, Martin, you are the champion for solution 5.
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I'm fine with the transitional. I mean, it's if it's moves the ecosystem forward, it's perfectly good for me.
Okay,
I
cool.
like it.
So
I like
the
it because it gives a clear direction. You know, it gives a clear path forward. And the fact that my earlier question was actually a bit interested about not supporting the disable error propagation request parameter. The fact that you can have a server that is not supporting a legacy client, I think is a good way forward. Like we can imagine a future where all the servers will be like new servers, and we can basically, I don't know, maybe we won't be able to drop it completely, but we can focus documentation and explanation on the new way of doing things instead of keeping both things forever. So as long as we can do that, I'm fine with solution 1.
Okay, so I think that we've effectively got 2 solutions now. We've got solution 1 and we've got Lee's new solution, which none of us have read through fully yet. So we need to figure that out and see whether there's anything worth seeing in the hybrid of them both, or whether Lee's is solves everything and is the great solution. But I think that's the main thing that we need to solve. So if we aim to do that, like if we aim to read over that by the time of the next GraphQL working group, I think that'd be really valuable.
Cool.
But yeah,
I
I
think
think
how
this has
I'm
been
gonna run.
productive.
Yeah, I gotta read through it too. I think how I'm gonna run it is I'll say that I'm abandoning 4 as the champion, and it sounds like Martin is abandoning 5 as the champion. If anybody wants to take these on, speak now, otherwise they'll be dropped, and then we can try to do sort of
I mean, I'm
an
happy
elimination.
to stay the champion and offer a solution that's not being implemented. That's fine with me. I can still be the reference if someone comes up, and asks question or anything.
Well, if you're
But
not backing it and no one else wants to back it, then we don't have to like
all right,
discuss or vote
let's
on it,
move. Let's move. Yeah, let's move.
Yeah. Um, and then yeah, we can do like just sort of an elimination discussion and vote after that. Um, is there no 6? Or is what is, I thought there was another one for some reason.
Six is the same as 1, just it uses a directive instead of an asterisk. And
Okay.
I'm okay as just treating them as effectively the same. And I think 6 doesn't actually have a champion, so I'm happy to also be the champion of that. Or someone else to be. I mean, if there was going to be spec edits with it, the spec edits will be almost the same as the spec edits for 1. It's just they won't have the syntax stuff in it. So I'm happy to be champion of both. But
Are you
essentially, go on.
being champion because you want it to stay on the table, or are you being champion like
I think that the better solution is solution 1,
okay.
but if the asterisk was to be sufficiently voted down, I think the correct then solution is solution 6.
Okay. Okay. So you think it's still got it. Okay. That's fine.
It's effectively a variant, right? It's just a variant of the same solution.
Yeah.
And much less of a variant than putting a question mark into the mix was, which turned out was a lot more complex than I thought it was.
Cool. All right. I'll see if I can carve out like 40 minutes of the next working group meeting so we can get this settled. And then I think I'm also fine with the uh request parameter. I think that's cool too. Oh, we're a little bit
Yeah,
over time.
that's something that is shared between all solutions, I think. Whatever we decide, we need a request parameter, and looks like there is consensus there. So
Yep.
it's might be a bit early to go back to GraphQL JS implementation and GraphQL Java and everyone. But maybe after next, it could be a topic for next working group actually. If we all agree about this, change the current disable error propagation into request parameters.
Sure. Yeah, that
I
sounds good to
think
me.
I think I'm going to change it again to be just called errors. So it's going to be errors propagate, errors null, errors abort. And the addition of abort, I think, is actually a thing that I would like to discuss with you all. I
Okay.
was hoping to today, but we ran out of time. But I actually think that errors abort is actually quite valuable for like command line scripts and the like. So yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
for everyone that doesn't want partial results, basically.
Exactly. If you want to just throw away the request, if any error happens, then using errors abort allows the server to bail out of execution much sooner.
I have one last thing. I mean, we're end of March. We are planning a release of the spec in July, I think. Is that something we try to rush through?
Did we actually pick a date?
I don't think I saw July somewhere. I'm pretty sure I saw July as a tentative date or something like that.
I think if it looks like nullability is on the verge of being merged into the schema, into the spec, sorry, then we will probably delay cutting the spec until it's in.
That
Okay.
would be nice. That would be cool.
That'd be really great. Anything else before we wrap up? We can continue on Discord as well. All right. Very productive. Thank you all for being here. I very much appreciate it. Great work, folks. Good stuff.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Alex.
Al.
See you.